But a large number of Canadians, younger Canadians, have grown up never having been in a place of worship at all because their parents never went.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ralph Benmergui. Welcome to Not That Kind of Rabbi. I hope you're having a decent day here in the environs of Hamilton, Ontario, where I happen to live these days. It is hot and muggy. Now, muggy is not something you usually find in another part of the country that I've lived. And in that part of the country, when they tell you it's 30 below, you say, yes, but it's a dry cold. But I did spend 2 years in Winnipeg, and my guest today has spent longer than that in the fine city of Winnipeg. And he spent the last 21 years writing columns on faith and religion for the Winnipeg Free Press. John Longhurst is my guest. Welcome to the program. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you. It is a dry rain in Winnipeg today.
Are they fogging these days?
No, we haven't had much of a mosquito problem for the last few years. So we've been very fortunate in that regard.
It's probably for all the wrong reasons that you haven't had mosquitoes, but we'll worry about that later. You have a book. Tell me the title of the book.
It's called Can Robots Love God and Be Saved?
Now, you took that from one of your columns that you wrote for the Free Press, right?
That's correct. And the book is a book of columns that I had written for the Free Press over the last 20 years. I was approached by a local publisher to do a book of my columns based on my 20th anniversary of writing faith page columns for the Winnipeg Free Press. By that point, there would probably have been around 900 or so columns, so it was quite an effort to go through them to see what ones still stood the test of time. And of course, and you probably appreciate this too, Ralph, when you look back at your early stuff saying, my gosh, how could I have written such crap? But you learn, you move, you grow, and I did manage to select a number of columns to put in the book.
So let me ask you this, in looking over that 20-year period, has society's view of faith changed? And if it has, in what ways over the last 20 years?
Oh, absolutely, it has changed. Canada is a very, very different place religiously today than it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago. Back in the 1960s, more Canadians went to church, and it was mostly church at the time because Canada was a very largely Christian nation. But most Canadians went to worship services, more Canadians went to worship services than in the United States, which is a country that we consider to be sort of hyper-religious. Well, today, more Americans would go to worship services on a regular basis than in Canada. In Canada, the number of Canadians who have dropped out of religion has increased exponentially. And today, there are many, many Canadians who have no affiliation at all with any religious group, although they might still identify themselves as Christian, Jew, Hindu, or Sikh, or something else.
Right. They see it more as a cultural piece than a practical piece.
Right, or something their grandparents did or their parents did, or it was a heritage. I went to Sunday school when I was young, something like that. But a large number of Canadians, younger Canadians, have grown up never having been in a place of worship at all because their parents never went.
Right.
Now, when I was young, and I'm in my late 60s, it wasn't an option about going to church or not. If you happened to tell your dad, well, I don't think I'll go this morning, that would have been a very short conversation. Today, if a kid says, no, I don't think I'll go, fine, that's okay. Or the parents have never gone themselves and the kids never go. So it's a very different environment. Studies, research has shown that Canadians continue to be spiritual. They say they pray. They say many of them, most of them, believe in God or a higher power. But very few of them would attend worship services on a regular basis.
Yeah, I tend to see it as we've moved from organized religion to disorganized religion. You know, the biggest movement is spiritual but not religious.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. So people are putting together their own kind of spirituality, and it's a mixture of things. One of the mixtures that I came across years ago and that I wrote about was a mixture of Jewish and Buddhism called Jubu.
That's
and
right.
So, for example, you take the best of both. And yesterday I interviewed a Christian woman who teaches yoga. So it's a Hindu philosophy that she's importing into her conservative Christian beliefs. And these kinds of things are happening all the time.
Well, it seems for some people there's a yearning for an embodied spiritual experience as opposed to a presentational. I go, there's a sermon, there's a hierarchy, there's a clergy. They want to feel. So in the Jubu, there's the seminal book Jew in the Lotus by Roger Kamenetz, right? I mean, he talks about this yearning for what the East can bring to Judaism. So the Dalai Lama meets Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who's one of the founders of the Jewish Renewal Movement, and the rabbi wants to know from the Dalai Lama, what is the spiritual content? How do you embody that through meditation and practice? And the Dalai Lama wants to know, how did Jews survive in a diaspora for thousands of years? Because now we're in a diaspora. So there is that cross-pollination, right?
And that cross-pollination is so very, very easy today, not just because of social media, but certainly because of that. But my neighbors are sick. So when you talk about the Eastern religions, 50 years ago, I might have thought, well, that's someplace in Asia. But today, it's my next door neighbor. And we meet people from other religions, other backgrounds, other cultures, just normally in the course of a day. And we get to exchange ideas, view things from their perspectives. And so these things are not not unfamiliar to us.
Right.
We now know these things in a way we never knew them before.
So Winnipeg always struck me as much more multicultural than people think. There were Mennonites, there were Dutch Reformed, there were Catholics and St. Boniface, there were Protestants, there were Jews, there were all these different people were part of the landscape and the kind of faith geography of Manitoba. How has that changed as you look over those essays and decide which ones to put in the book?
Well, I would say of Manitoba today that it is very widely inter and multi-faith. The Muslim community has grown quite a bit. The Jewish community, conversely, has shrunk. It's not nearly as large as it used to be. Winnipeg used to be such a huge center for Judaism in Canada, but many of the children and grandchildren of those original Jewish settlers who came to Winnipeg in the 19th century, 1920s, etc., they moved on to Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal and places like that. Although, interestingly enough, I'm hearing anecdotally from Jewish members of the Jewish community that their children and grandchildren are moving back for two reasons. One, they want to be close to family. It's always nice to have babysitting close to hand. And secondly, they can afford a house.
Right.
So when you talked earlier about it's a dry cold, when people talk about Winnipeg, we say, yeah, it's an affordable cold. And they can afford a house here that they could never imagine they might be able to own in Toronto or Vancouver. So the Jewish community is beginning to see a bit of a renaissance, including with immigration from places like Argentina and Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So it continues to be multi-faith. There's a very strong and powerful multi-faith movement here that's been around for a long, long time. And it's a good mix. One interesting element that we're beginning to see more and more of, and something that I'm trying to keep tabs on, is Indigenous spirituality, which is a funny way of framing it. And I have to say right off the bat, that's a Western way of framing it, because I'm very aware that Indigenous people don't separate their physical and their spiritual realities. And so when I use that, I'm using that in a Western categorization. But more and more people of faith, of all faiths, are beginning to recognize that Indigenous people have something to bring to the table as well. The 7 teachings, for example, the ceremonies, those kinds of things are becoming more and more important as people think about how they want to practice and understand their faith. They are reaching out to Indigenous people to learn from them as well.
It's when I went to Winnipeg to live, I was a Toronto boy, and I was shocked by the state of Indigenous urban life. I was appalled by what we have done. And it was a profound feeling that you couldn't escape from. You couldn't just turn your head and look the other way, because it was everywhere, and those people were everywhere. that I had never really noticed in Toronto. So I wonder, what is it that they're offering to us now that we can learn from, as opposed to how many of them that I met that had adopted Catholicism or Protestant faith and had been missionized? What can they offer us in reverse?
Well, the first thing I would note is that the majority of Canadian Indigenous people still identify as either Catholic or Anglican. You could say those are the religions of their colonizers, but many of them still see themselves as being part of those two branches of Christianity. That said, many, many others are beginning to find ways of indigenizing that faith and incorporating their Indigenous ceremonies, understandings, beliefs into their Christian beliefs and practices. You're seeing more of that. The Métis are doing that as well. And I see our two archbishops of the Catholic Church here in Manitoba encouraging that. I'm not sensing anyone discouraging the Indigenous people from incorporating those things into their spiritual practices. On the contrary, I'm seeing them encouraging it. The other thing to note, too, and I will say that, of course, the same social issues still exist in Winnipeg. There's no denying that. We are standing on the other side of the very, very important apology by Pope Francis to Indigenous people, starting in Rome in 2020, in March, April 2022. I had the privilege of being there, of accompanying Indigenous people as they went to Rome to report on that experience. And then when he came to Alberta and made that first formal apology to Indigenous people for the residential schools, for the doctrine of discovery. Those are two very important things. It will take a long, long time for that to work its way through the system, for Indigenous people to truly begin to believe and trust the Catholic Church again. There's still a lot of pain and hurt. I mean, there are still people who are alive who were taken from their parents to go to residential schools. Yeah. And there's no way that we can deny that experience or deny their pain. It will take time to work that through the system, but I see hope in that at least. And I see hope in many of the Canadian Catholic hierarchy who are recognizing their culpability, the Church's culpability in that. As one archbishop told me when I was in Rome, we didn't do that. We didn't create the residential schools. We weren't there during that apex, but they belong to us. It's our responsibility, and we have to live with it, and we have to find ways to reconcile with Indigenous people over it. So that's a very positive move, and I'm very grateful for that.
Is life really miserable for the Jews, or are we just glued to a 24-hour news cycle?
Should we be worried that so many young rabbis are coming out of seminary as anti-Zionists?
And what does Judaism say about polyamory?
If you want answers to these questions, well, we don't have any. But we do love asking them. Each week, tune into Bonjour Chai to hear debates and hot takes by me, Avi Feingold,
and me, Phoebe Maltz-Bovey,
as we sit down with pundits, rabbis, and scholars to talk about the most pressing issues facing Jews in Canada and around the world.
Listen and subscribe to Bonjour Chai at thecjn.ca/bonjour or wherever you get your podcasts.
So, how has reporting on faith and religion, how has that shaped your journey in faith and religion?
Well, maybe I'll just start answering that question, Ralph, by going back 40 or more years to a time when you'll remember when every major Canadian daily newspaper in this country would have had a faith page, sometimes called the church page, and often a faith beat. And you would have had the Toronto Star, Vancouver Sun, Calgary Herald, Edmonton Journal, Winnipeg Free Press, Montreal Gazette, you name it, had a faith reporter because it was considered an important beat. Today, I am the only religion reporter left in Canada. I'm freelance as well, and I can say more about that. But there is, when Mary Hines retired in December, CBC shut down her program.
Tapestry.
Tapestry. And she and I were the last two paying any attention to this subject. And now I'm the only one left in a secular major daily newspaper. The broadcast media have, especially TV, have almost never had anyone focused on this. The CBC did, of course, over its time, but now it doesn't have anyone specializing in that either. So that is one big thing. I've swum in this water for a long time. First, as a communication specialist working for nonprofit, faith-based nonprofit NGOs, especially on the international relief and development side of things, and more recently writing for the Free Press. The way this has shaped me is, first of all, seeing all of my former colleagues retire or pass away and nobody replacing them, and one day looking around and realizing I'm the last one. And secondly, I have to say, from a personal point of view, it's enriched me so very, very much. Getting to know the beliefs, the cultures, the families, the worshiping ways of so many different faith groups, it's just broadened my world, enriched it in so many ways. And I'm just, I think, a bigger and better person, a broader person for that. And that's something I tried to convey through my writing, that it's a big world out there, and there are lots of really interesting people who are doing amazing things, and it would be good for us to get to know them and hear about them.
You know, there's a book, One River, Many Wells. Do you think that we're all basically doing that, just digging wells to the same river, and it just happens to be done in different ways? Or do you see real differences in religions that are not easily bridged?
That's a very, very big and profound question, as you know, and you would get a lot of different answers to that one. If you were to ask that question of a Baha'i, they would say, well, of course, that's the basic belief of the Baha'i religion. Sikhs also have a very broad-minded way of viewing other religions. Of course, some forms of Christianity and Islam do not see that at all. What I like to say is that in Christianity, there's this thing called the Golden Rule, and many people have heard about it. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. It comes across in different ways in the Christian way of saying it, but that sentiment exists pretty much in every major religion. The idea that you should act with compassion and kindness towards others is at the root of almost every religion. Of course, the religions don't always live up to that, but every religion has that as a core principle. And I think that's the thing that can help bind us all together.
You know, interestingly, in the Jewish version, it's posed in the negative. Do not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. Mm-hmm. But, you know, there's a lot of people who, when you talk to them about the idea of being religious or religion, they can only see it as highly damaging, that religion has caused such pain and misery and separation. What do you think after all these years? What do you think of that idea?
There are a couple of ways of thinking about that. First of all, religion certainly has much to account for. By that I mean organized religion, residential schools, the terrible clergy sex scandals involving children and others, not just the Catholics. There's a huge sex scandal like that in the Southern Baptist Convention in the United States. No church, no religion can say, oh, that doesn't happen to us. Wherever there are people with power, too often men with power, these kinds of things happen. So in some respects, organized religion has earned, in a negative way, has earned that reputation. They've allowed or have permitted some very terrible things to happen. On the other hand, I would also point out, though, that many people, not now always, but over time, many people have gotten the information they have about religion from the daily media. And they are more inclined to read or hear a story about a priest that commits sexual abuse than they are to read a story about a priest who serves faithfully the homeless in his community for 40 years
Right.
and retires having left an amazing legacy. Those stories don't make the news very often, but the negative ones, the bad ones, almost always do. And so on the face of it, I would say that most people, if they think about what they know about religion at all, will have heard bad things. Here in Canada, we also have the evangelical effect from the United States. We have a border, but most people don't think of it. They just see that 80+% of American evangelicals, self-identified evangelicals, voted for Trump the last 2 elections. And they don't distinguish between evangelicals in that country and evangelicals here. And so that's going to form a negative impression as well for a lot of people who see Trump in a very negative light.
Yeah, I interviewed Joel Osteen and people like that. And I went to an evangelical church here in southern Ontario. Vastly different experiences of evangelism in those two cultures, I must say. In the book, you've had a lot to choose from. What are some of the ones that you're most fond of? What are some of the columns you're most fond of?
Well, one of the ones that actually leads the book is about the role of religion. It plays off a story that a football coach told some years ago that he said, football is like religion. It has an answer for everything. A good football defense like religion, has an answer for everything. And that was the challenge that I took on, which was, no, I don't think so. A good religion actually has a question for everything. It doesn't have the answers. If all it has to give you is answers, then it's not a very good religion, because it's not challenging you, and it's probably got wrong answers anyway, and it's not allowing you to use your natural curiosity to see what might be available in the world and what kinds of things you should be learning. So that was a very favorite one. Oh, there's so many in there that you've caught me by surprise trying to think of them right now. But one thing I will say, especially for this particular audience, one of the greatest privileges of my life, and this is something I never expected to be able to do, was to interview Holocaust survivors. I think I must be up to 8 or 9 or 10 by now, where I've been able to either sit down in person or during the pandemic, of course, by Zoom or phone, with elderly Holocaust survivors and ask them what seemed to me to be some of the most painful questions, and have them so graciously respond to me and tell me their stories. Such incredible pain, and yet such an incredible conviction as well, to make sure the world knows that this really happened, and it happened to them. And so I've been moved so much by those opportunities to meet them, and I think I concluded a column exactly on that topic of how much it has moved me. That said, another column that I think is in there as well that I really enjoyed writing was just about what was the effect of the Holocaust, not just on the survivors, but on their children and grandchildren, and realizing that trauma works its way through generations. And, like a woman here in Winnipeg I know who grew up without any cousins because her mother's and father's families were all destroyed in the Holocaust. So what's it like seeing all your friends going off to their relatives' houses but not having any uncles or aunts, And you realize that's a really visceral thing that brings it home in a way that you might not imagine. So those are some of the things that really stuck out for me.
Yeah, they're very powerful things, very powerful. So when you look back now on those things, if someone asked you, are you a person of faith, what would you say?
Yes, absolutely, unequivocally. But I would say I'm also a person with questions. I'm also a person who is open and doesn't think that the canon of what religion is constituted of is closed once and forever. There's only one answer, and this is the answer. I would say that there is the spark of divine in everyone, and that it's a lot of it is about being alert to something. If you're not alert to religion, if you're not alert to spirituality, or as we might say, if you're not alert to what God might be doing in the world around you, you probably won't see God, and you probably won't see any spirituality. You'll see coincidences maybe, or something that's really amazing or beautiful, but you won't see anything else. And what I've tried to do through my writing, through my reporting, is be alert to those things, to see things, to look at a story and say, I wonder what else is going on behind there. What's the faith element? What is the passion that drives this person to do what they're doing? Not just they did something marvelous, but what motivated them to do it? And often you find it's got some sort of faith-related reason.
I want to see more Mennonite comedies. There's not enough of that. I used to go to see theater in the dead of winter in Winnipeg, and it'd be a Mennonite playwright, and it'd be the most depressing piece of theater I think I've ever seen. And I just think, for the love of God, people, it's already 30 below and it's February. Would you please make me laugh?
Well, I have attended a Mennonite church for a long time. I'm presently not attending one, but Mennonites have their own Holocaust-like experience as well in the former Soviet Union, and with tens of thousands of disappeared relatives and friends, and flight and escape, and after World War II, pulling out and escaping the Soviets. So there's a lot of trauma and horror that they have been cycling through of late as well. So but I'm not surprised that you have some of that.
But Jews do that, and they end up writing comedies. So, I'm just saying, come on, get with it.
Well, then I think what you need to do is you need to get some guests on your show to talk about exactly that. And there's a woman online that you might want to interview called the Drunk Mennonite. She does cocktail mixes. And she tries to tell the Mennonite story through drinks.
Through a haze.
Finds a different way of doing that. So that might be a way to come at it.
So you're still freelancing for the Free Press, right?
Yes. Well, let me tell you, if you don't mind, I'll just tell you how this came about. So in 2018, the editor of the Winnipeg Free Press, Paul Simin, announced that the paper wanted to engage the Winnipeg communities more. Communities, not just the community, but all the communities that make up Winnipeg. And of course, this is because the media is really struggling, and it knows that it needs to be more engaged with the people who read it, and in order to survive. And so I went to Paul and Bob Cox, who was the publisher at the time, and said, well, if you want to engage communities in Winnipeg, one community you're not engaging very well is the faith community, which is quite active in this city. And they said they would love to engage that community more, but they didn't have any money. And I said, what if I go out and raise it? And they said if I could do that, they would do it. So 25 different faith groups and a crowdfunder that we run twice a year raises between $20,000 and $30,000 to support my freelance religion reporting. That includes from the Jewish Federation of Winnipeg, which is a very significant and much appreciated supporter. And with that, I then do reporting, probably between 2 and 4 stories a week on faith in Winnipeg. That it can be less, it can be more. Usually it comes out between 14 and 20 stories a month on faith, columns, stories, reports, just because there's just so much interesting stuff going on. Tomorrow night is the 25th anniversary of a very significant Muslim organization, social services organization. A week or two ago, I wrote about Holocaust Memorial Day and everything in between. As the community marks its important dates, celebrates people that are important in their community, and reflects on different aspects of life as they know it here.
Yeah, well, look, I wish there were a lot more people doing what you're doing right now, because there's a lot, as you say, underneath that first layer is the most interesting pieces, which any journalist will tell you is true. And as a good journalist, obviously, you've figured out that it's not about black and white. It's about that wonderful gray area that we all live in. That's where we meet. So the book is out?
The book will be out on June 12th.
And tell people what it's called again?
It's called Can Robots Love God and Be Saved?
All right, so excellent. John Longhurst is the author of that book, and I don't know if robots and God can intermingle enough to save anything at this point in time. We didn't even get into AI, but we'll do that at another time. I really thank you for your contributions, and I really do wish there were a lot more John Longhursts in the country doing the work you're doing. You take care of yourself, okay?
Thank you, Ralph. It was a pleasure meeting you and talking with you.
You too. Take care. Thanks for listening to Not That Kind of Rabbi. If you enjoyed your time with us, we'd love for you to subscribe to this show wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Ralph Benmergui. Our show is produced and edited by Michael Freeman. We're part of the CJN Podcast Network. And to support our work with a tax-deductible donation, all you have to do is visit thecjn.ca/donate. Take care of each other. Bye.
Y'all remember that joke from Airplane? The old lady asked for some light reading.
How about this leaflet, famous Jewish sports legends?
But in actuality, that's changing. Jews are crushing it in sports around the world, and we are here to celebrate them.
Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout.
Zach Hyman, his first career hat trick. 41 points for Diddy Avdia. It's Sue Bird's building.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jamie.
We love Jews and we love sports, but most of all, we love kvelling over Jews in sports.
Together we host Menschwarmers, the longest running Jewish sports podcast in the world. Listen and subscribe at thecjn.ca and wherever you find your podcasts.